My childhood was that of a ragamuffin or a child of the regiment because even from the time I was born in 1926, I lived on an army post, and by and large, these were rough young men. Many of them offered the opportunity to avoid prison by going into the army. And so my friends, when they paid any attention to me, many of them were ex-criminals. Years later, when people began talking about religion, I realized that my father was very religious in a formal Christian sense, but did not feel obligated to send me to school. Instead, he just wanted me to try to understand right from wrong, and that was a big undertaking because on an army post in those days, the children ran around usually unattended and would go into one another's houses at lunchtime for a little bit to eat. Once I went into a house that was very friendly. This is when I was about 5 years old in the Philippines, and the woman of the house, Margaret, was planning a tea party that afternoon and had baked a beautiful chocolate cake, which I found in the refrigerator. Nobody else in the house at that moment, so I carved out a huge slice and ate all of that slice, and then left, and I never understood how they identified me as the culprit so quickly after the event. But it was all a family, a community of pilots and their wives in the Philippines and even later in San Antonio, Texas, who watched over everyone's children. Later, I was sent to the Sewanee Military Academy, which was the very heart and soul of American Episcopalianism, and I grew up, in a sense, at that time, full of a sense of right and wrong, and generosity toward others, and many family stories in my tradition about survival in the face of poverty and economic booms and busts. But I was not particularly religious, and the more I associated with young theological students at Sewanee, the more I was convinced that they didn't take all of their studies very seriously either. And so Sewanee was, for me, 4 years of reconciliation between form and content. The attitude at West Point, where the 300 men in my class came from all over the United States, was to help blend a kind of professional attitude and a sense of service rather than to demand any particular philosophy. If there were a great deal of selfishness, then that particular cadet would, as we said as cadets, smell hell until they had burned that out of him. Because West Point, and to a similar degree Sewanee, is so dedicated to a sense of the idea of God at work in the world, I could not escape that. Instead, it challenged me to think more deeply about it and what it really meant to me, and so I kept on doing that at West Point, where I found many people in my class of my age willing to discuss these things. It touches on a subject which is closely related to religious beliefs, but goes to something deeper, and that is a sense of one's own integrity, one's authenticity. That is, who are you? How does one learn and follow through on identity when all of these questions are raging around that person's mind with his or her generation? And I could remember that my sense of identity from childhood to West Point and beyond was rooted in my deep affection for my father. He had, in so many ways, guided me through behavior, but through choices that I had to make about strange people, Filipinos, different cultures, later even in Bogota, Colombia, so that my childhood was filled with not my own kind, if you will, but children and adults from other cultures. And I watched the way my father treated all of them with the same respect. One of the things that gave me sustenance at West Point in a philosophical sense, that regardless of origin, regardless of attitude, other people were also acting out roles in order to try to cope with some of the stresses that were deliberately created at West Point, among others, for example, to give a cadet more to do than he could possibly accomplish in a given time limit. And that learning, of course, became very important to me when I began to realize that there was no such thing as a fixed priority of behavior, that you had to be flexible enough to change priorities, but that meant that you had to shift from one drama to another and then react to it in some way that would seem to be adequate. And those early practices in all kinds of situations at West Point gave me a sense of confidence, not so much in exact right or wrong, but what would be appropriate to the situation. And only later was I able to say this philosophy of drama, of Shakespeare, that all things are a stage, still needed a deepening awareness of identity.